The confession came after midnight, in the one room in the castle where Lucien was not entirely a king. His private study was a place of worn leather and the scent of aging paper, a sanctuary where the weight of his crown seemed to settle into the ancient stones of the walls. Moonlight, thin and silver, sliced through the tall arched window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. It was a light Arya had always loved, a gentler cousin to the sun she so fiercely missed within these perpetually shadowed halls. She stood before his desk, a sheaf of trade summaries held loosely in her hands, the vellum cool against her skin. For 6 days now, this strange, heavy silence had stretched between them whenever they were alone, a stark contrast to the easy camaraderie that had defined their years of service and friendship. He had not looked at the summaries. His eyes, the color of a twilight sky just before the first star appears, were fixed on her. They had been for hours, it seemed. "Arya," he said, and the single word was not a summons but a plea. The sound of it, stripped of command, made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She waited. The ticking of the grand celestial clock in the corner was a slow, deliberate heartbeat in the quiet room. Lucien rose from his chair, his movements possessing the fluid, predatory grace she had long grown accustomed to. Yet tonight it felt different, less controlled. He moved around the great oak desk, a barrier he had always maintained, and stopped a few feet from her. The air crackled, thick with unspoken things. "For 500 years," he began, his voice a low thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, "I have known solitude. It has been my consort, my counselor, my most constant companion. I have ruled, I have conquered, I have endured. I believed it was the price of what I am, an immutable truth." He took another step, and she had to fight the instinct to retreat. "And then you came into my court. A human, bright and brief and impossibly stubborn, with ink stains on your fingers, and a mind that saw the world not as a chessboard of power, but as a tapestry of lives." Her heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, where this was going. She wanted to stop him, to hold up a hand and preserve the precious, fragile thing their friendship had been. But his gaze held her captive. "You have become the center of my world, Arya," he said, the admission raw, torn from him. "The silence is no longer a companion. It is a void where your voice should be. The shadows are not a comfort. They are merely the absence of your light. I look at you, and I feel a hope I thought had turned to dust centuries ago. I love you." The words hung in the air, immense and terrifying. "I love you." Not the possessive declaration of a king, but the vulnerable confession of a man. A man who was not a man. A creature of eternal night, of blood and shadow. And she, woman of sunlight and fleeting seasons. The trade summaries slipped from her numb fingers, scattering across the dark, polished floorboards like fallen leaves. She shook her head, a small, helpless gesture. "My lord," she whispered, her voice tight with a sorrow so profound it threatened to choke her. "You cannot." A shadow of pain crossed his features, so sharp and quick it was like a blade's glint in the moonlight. "Cannot? Or will not?" "It is not a matter of will," she struggled to explain, her hands twisting in front of her. "What you feel, it is the novelty. I am a curiosity, a warm, breathing diversion in an endless existence of cold stone and colder eternity. You are a king, Lucien. You are forever. I am a season. I am the warmth of the sun on my skin, the taste of rain, the feeling of grass beneath my feet. I am the bloom of a rose and its inevitable decay. My humanity is all I truly possess. It is my treasure, and it is finite." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I cannot give it up. I will not. To become what you are, it would be to lose the very things that make me myself, and you would grow tired of the ghost that remained." In 100 years or 200, you would look at me and see only a pale imitation of the woman you once thought you loved. And I would be trapped in an endless night, mourning a son I could no longer remember. His face, which had been open and vulnerable, slowly hardened, the mask of the monarch sliding back into place. The hurt was still there, visible in the tight set of his jaw, the chilling stillness in his eyes, but it was now sheathed in the ice of wounded pride. You believe my heart so shallow? So fickle? I believe your existence is vast, she countered gently, tears welling. And mine is a breath, a whisper. It is not a failing in you, my lord. It is a difference in us that cannot be bridged. He did not argue further, he simply stood there, a statue carved from shadow and disappointment. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with anticipation. It was a cold, dead thing. An ending. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of dismissal that was more cutting than any curse. I see. She bent to retrieve the scattered papers, her movements stiff. When she straightened, he had already returned to his desk, his back to her, a king once more upon his throne. She placed the summaries on the corner of the desk, her hand trembling slightly. Good night, Your Majesty. He did not reply. The silence was his answer. As she walked to the door, she felt his gaze on her back, a physical weight of loss and anger. She closed the door softly behind her, the latch clicking into place with a sound of utter finality, leaving him alone in the moonlight with the ghost of a love that had died the very moment it was born. The hallway was long and cold, and for the first time, the castle's shadows felt not like a shelter, but a cage. The days that followed were a study in cold, excruciating civility. The easy warmth that had defined their interactions vanished, replaced by a chasm of rigid formality. He was Your Majesty. She was Advisor Arya. Their meetings were brief, efficient, and confined strictly to matters of state. He would look at a point just over her shoulder, his face an unreadable mask of aristocratic indifference. Arya, for her part, poured herself into her work with a desperate fervor, using complex trade negotiations and tax reforms as a shield against the hollow ache in her chest. The castle, once a place of purpose and quiet contentment, became a landscape of her grief. Every familiar corridor, every stone archway, echoed with the memory of shared laughter and quiet conversations that would never happen again. 2 weeks after his confession, the games began. It started subtly. A visiting dignitary from the Southern Isles, a vampire duchess of legendary beauty and cruel wit, was seated next to him at a state dinner. Arya watched from her customary place further down the table as Lucian inclined his head toward the duchess, his smile a flash of white in the candlelight, his attention entirely consumed. He laughed at something she said, a low, intimate sound that curled in Arya's stomach like a serpent. She felt the eyes of the court on her, their gazes flickering between her and the king, hungry for the scent of drama. Arya kept her expression placid, her spine straight, and took a slow, deliberate sip of wine, though it tasted like dust in her mouth. It was only the beginning. The Duchess was followed by a succession of others, a fiery sorceress from the mountain clans, her laughter echoing in the halls at all hours. A lithe, silent creature of the Fey courts who danced for him in the moonlight of the central courtyard. A human noblewoman with eyes as dark as his own, who would touch his arm with a casual possessiveness that made Arya's hands clench into fists beneath the table. Lucian's cruelty was an art form, it was never overt. It was in the way he would seek Arya's gaze from across a crowded ballroom, just as he offered his hand to another. It was in the casual mention of a late-night ride or a private concert, in a tone loud enough for her to overhear. He was not merely flaunting his conquests, he was curating them for an audience of one. Each woman was a carefully chosen instrument, each public display a meticulously composed note in a symphony of torment designed to elicit a single reaction from her. Jealousy. He was desperate for it, starving for any sign that her refusal had not been born of indifference, but of a heart that could still be wounded. He wanted proof that she cared, and for months he got it. Each new companion was a fresh twist of the knife in Arya's heart. She endured the whispers of the court, the pitying looks from the servants, the triumphant smirks from her rivals. She learned to school her features into a mask of serene neutrality, but inside, she was unraveling. At night, alone in her chambers, the facade would crumble. She would press her face into her pillow to muffle the sounds of her weeping, the pain a physical entity, a jagged stone lodged in her chest. She saw his actions for what they were, a desperate, wounded lashing out, but the understanding did little to soothe the agony. He was trying to hurt her, and he was succeeding magnificently. Her heart, which she had tried to protect by preserving her humanity, was being systematically broken by the very man she had refused for fear of this exact pain. The irony was a bitter poison. She grew thinner, the vibrant energy that had always defined her dimming to a low, flickering ember. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. She still performed her duties with flawless precision, her mind a refuge of facts and figures where the chaos of her emotions could not follow. But the light was leaving her. She would catch her reflection in a polished shield or a silver platter and see a stranger looking back, a pale, haunted woman with eyes that held the ghosts of too many sleepless nights. He was winning. He was proving that she was not immune to him, that her heart was as entangled as he had hoped. But it was a hollow, destructive victory, and the battlefield was her soul. She was bleeding out, slowly, quietly, in the gilded cage of his court. And the king, in his blindness, saw only the blood, not the life that was draining away with it. The change was not a sudden storm, but a slow, creeping frost. It began in the 4th month of Lucian's campaign of calculated cruelty. The pain, once a sharp, unceasing agony, had become a dull, chronic ache. It was a part of her now, like the beat of her own heart, and she had learned to live around it, to function in spite of it. But familiarity breeds a strange kind of exhaustion. One cannot live at a constant pitch of heartbreak. The soul, in its drive for self-preservation, begins to numb. The first sign was a flicker of weariness. At a vernal equinox ball, Lucian appeared with a princess from a northern kingdom, a woman famed for her voice, said to be woven from moonlight and sorrow. As she sang, her voice filling the grand hall, Lucian's eyes found Arya's across the room. He was standing close to the princess, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture of intimate possession. Arya met his gaze, and for a moment, she felt the familiar clench of her stomach, the cold sting behind her eyes. But then, it was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep tiredness. She was so tired of this game, so tired of the pain. She held his gaze for a second longer, then deliberately turned her attention to the intricate tapestry on the far wall, studying the depiction of an ancient battle as if it were the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. She did not look back. That night, she did not cry. She lay in her bed, staring at the canopy above, and felt not a storm of grief, but a quiet, desolate emptiness. The stone in her chest was still there, but it no longer felt jagged. It had been worn smooth by a constant torrent of sorrow, and now it was just a dead weight. The memory of his confession, which had once been a source of sharp, bittersweet pain, now felt like a story she had read about someone else. Over the next few weeks, the frost spread. When she saw him with a new companion, a willowy artist with paint stains on her elegant fingers, she felt a distant flicker of something. Annoyance, perhaps, at the sheer predictability of it all. But the heart-wrenching jealousy was gone. It had burned itself out, leaving behind only ash. She began to see his actions not as a personal attack, but as a pathetic theatrical performance. He was a king playing a part for an audience that was no longer watching. The power he had held over her emotions, the power to wound her with a look or a gesture, was dissolving. The true turning point came during a council meeting. Lucian was questioning a report she had submitted, his tone unnecessarily sharp, a public display of his displeasure. A month ago, this would have mortified her, sending her into a spiral of hurt and anxiety. But today, she simply met his gaze across the polished table, her own expression calm, almost placid. "The data is sound, Your Majesty," she said, her voice even. "The projections are based on the established trade patterns of the last decade. If you would like to see the raw figures, they are in the appendix." There was no tremor in her voice, no flush on her cheeks. She was a professional, an advisor presenting a report. The personal history that thrummed between them was, in that moment, entirely absent from her side of the equation. She saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, a momentary faltering of his cold authority. He had expected her to flinch, to show some sign of being affected. She had offered nothing. That evening, she looked at her own reflection in the silver-gilt mirror in her chambers. The dark circles were still there, but the haunted look was gone. In its place was a profound stillness, an unnerving emptiness. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, but a different kind of stranger now. Not a woman actively breaking, but one who was already broken and had begun to fossilize. The vibrant, passionate human who had treasured the sun and the rain was gone. In her place was this quiet, efficient creature of the shadows, hollowed out and calm. She felt a distant pang of grief for the woman she had been, but it was a detached sadness, like mourning a historical figure. She had stopped caring. The realization was not a triumph, it was a tragedy. He had wanted to prove she had a heart he could break. Instead, he had succeeded only in teaching her how to live without one. Lucian had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his own manufactured drama. He would arrange a display of affection, a shared glance, a lingering touch, a public whisper, and then his eyes would find Arya. He was an addict, searching for his fix. A flicker of pain in her gaze, a tightening of her lips, the subtle clenching of her hand around a wine goblet. These small reactions were the only proof he had that the connection between them, however damaged, still existed. They were the signs that she was not indifferent, that beneath her professional veneer, she was still the woman who had looked at him with such devastating honesty in his study. He planned the evening with the precision of a battle campaign. The guest of honor was a baroness from an old, powerful vampire lineage, known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue. She was a worthy political ally, but tonight she was merely a prop. He chose the setting carefully, the upper balcony overlooking the starlit gardens, a place where he and Arya had once spent hours debating philosophy and politics, their conversations easy and punctuated by shared laughter. He led the Baroness to the balustrade, positioning them in a pool of lantern light, perfectly visible to anyone in the gallery below, where he knew Arya was reviewing documents with the Chancellor. He leaned in close, his lips near the Baroness's ear, murmuring some meaningless compliment. He let his hand rest on her waist. Then, as he had done 100 times before, he lifted his gaze, seeking out Arya. She was there. She was looking directly at them, and he saw it. Nothing. It was not the carefully constructed neutrality he had grown used to, the mask she wore to hide her hurt. This was something else entirely. Her eyes, which had once been so expressive, so full of life and fire, were placid, empty. They were like polished stones, reflecting the lantern light, but holding none of it within. She looked at him, at the woman in his arms, with the same mild, dispassionate interest she might afford a piece of furniture. Her gaze lingered for a moment, registered the scene, and then, without a flicker of emotion, she turned back to the Chancellor and pointed to a line on the scroll he was holding. A cold dread, colder than the grave, seized him. It was a primal, absolute terror that eclipsed centuries of pride and power. The Baroness said something witty, but the sound didn't register. The entire, elaborate performance crumbled around him. All the women, all the cruel games, all the carefully orchestrated moments. They had all been a desperate, pathetic attempt to hear a single note of music from a string he had just systematically severed. He hadn't wanted to make her jealous. He had just wanted her to look at him, to see him. And she was looking right through him. The absence of her attention, the attention he had once taken for granted, was a physical void, a black hole that threatened to swallow him whole. He recoiled from the Baroness as if she were on fire. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. He turned and strode away without a backward glance, leaving his stunned guest on the balcony. He moved through the castle, his long strides eating up the stone corridors, a frantic energy propelling him forward. He was blind to the confused looks of his guards, deaf to the greetings of courtiers. He saw only her empty eyes, an endless, placid void where her love, her pain, her anything for him used to be. He had thought her refusal was the most painful thing he could experience. He was wrong. Her refusal had been born of passion, of a fierce love for her own life. It had been an act of a living, feeling heart. This was obliteration. He had waged a war to prove her heart was his to command, and in his brutal campaign he had not conquered it. He had annihilated it. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He, Lucian, the eternal king, had been terrified of many things in his long existence. Of fire, of betrayal, of the slow erosion of madness that came with immortality. But he had never known a terror like this. The terror of being rendered completely and utterly irrelevant to the one person whose existence gave his own any meaning. The game was over. He had lost in the most absolute way imaginable. He found her in the royal library, the one place that felt more hers than his. The air smelled of leather and dust and beeswax, a scent he would forever associate with her. She was standing by a high window, not reading, but staring out at the sliver of moon visible between the castle's dark ramparts. She did not seem surprised to see him when he entered. She merely turned her head slightly, her expression as placid as it had been on the balcony. The sight of that unnerving calm sent a fresh wave of panic through him. "Arya," he began, his voice strained, the sound alien in the hallowed silence of the library. She inclined her head. "Your Majesty." The title was a perfectly polished stone wall between them. He closed the distance between them, his desperation making his movements jerky, devoid of their usual grace. He stopped before her, searching her face for any flicker of the woman he knew. He found nothing. "What was that? Back there?" he demanded, his voice raw. "That look, that nothing." She blinked slowly, as if considering a mildly interesting philosophical question. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her tone level, devoid of accusation or pain. It was worse than any scream. "I was observing. You seemed occupied." "Occupied?" he echoed, his voice rising. A frantic, helpless anger began to churn within him. "I have spent months. He trailed off, the words catching in his throat as the sheer, ugly truth of his actions rose up to choke him. What had he done? He had paraded his court like a brutish schoolboy, trying to provoke a reaction. "Yes," she said, her voice still unnervingly quiet. "You have, and I have watched. It was instructive." The coldness of the word, instructive, was like a slap. "Instructed you in what?" he bit out. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in the depths of her eyes. It was not anger. It was a profound, ancient sorrow. "It instructed me that I was right," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It confirmed everything I feared." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about?" Finally, the dam of her composure broke. But it was not a flood of rage or tears. It was a slow, agonizing fracture. Her shoulders began to tremble, and she wrapped her arms around herself, as if holding her own splintering pieces together. All this, she gestured vaguely, a small, helpless motion that encompassed the months of torment. This entire performance. You did it to prove that I cared. But all it proved to me was how little you understood. Her voice cracked, and the sound was a shard of glass in his chest. You are a king, Lucian. You are an eternal, magnificent, terrifying creature of immense power. And I am a footnote, a human advisor, a brief candle flame in your endless night. Tears finally began to trace paths down her pale cheeks, but her eyes remained fixed on his, wide with a devastating, raw honesty. Did you ever once stop to think why I said no? She asked, her voice thick with unshed grief. It wasn't just the sun, Lucian. It wasn't just my mortality. It was because I knew I could never be enough. How could I? How could a mortal woman, who will age and wrinkle and fade, ever hope to hold the heart of a king who has seen empires rise and fall? I knew that your love would be a passing fascination, a beautiful, fleeting whim. And when it faded, as it inevitably would, I would be left a ghost, a relic of your affection, trapped in an eternity I never wanted. The pieces of her confession slammed into him, rearranging his entire understanding of her refusal. It hadn't been a rejection of him. It had been a desperate act of self-preservation, born of a profound sense of her own inadequacy. Your games, she choked out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. They didn't make me jealous. They just confirmed my deepest, most secret fear. They proved I was temporary, replaceable. You moved from one beautiful, powerful immortal to the next, and I saw the future you would have had with me. You proved that I was right to believe I was nothing more than a momentary diversion. You took my fear and you made it real. The full weight of his cruelty, of his catastrophic, monumental failure to understand, crashed down on him. He had heard her words about her humanity, but he had not listened to the terror beneath them. He had seen her refusal as a challenge to his affection, not as a cry of her own insecurity. In his wounded pride, he had set out to prove she loved him, and in doing so, he had systematically validated every single reason she believed she was unworthy of that love. He reached for her, an instinctive, desperate gesture, but she flinched back so violently it was as if he had burned her. The movement shattered him more than any words could have. He dropped his hand, his body slumping in defeat. The king, the conqueror, the ancient power, was gone. In his place was only a man, hollowed out by a grief so vast it threatened to unmake him. Arya, he whispered, his voice broken. I didn't know. No, she said, her voice flat, the tears still falling from those empty, empty eyes. You didn't. You saw a heart to conquer. You never thought to see the person it belonged to. She turned then and walked away, her steps steady, leaving him alone in the silent library with the ruins of what he had destroyed. The scent of old paper was no longer a comfort. It was the smell of ashes. The first month of his penance was an exercise in silence and distance. Lucian stripped his life of all its cruel theater. The court was dismissed of its guests. The music and revelry ceased. A somber quiet fell over the castle, mirroring the desolate landscape of his own soul. He understood now that words were useless. Apologies were hollow things, easily spoken and more easily disbelieved. The damage he had inflicted was not a simple wound that could be stitched and healed. He had poisoned the very ground of her trust in him. Any attempt at a grand gesture would be seen for what it was: another performance, another manipulation. So he chose a different path, a path of quiet, unwavering, and utterly unobtrusive devotion. He started by respecting the chasm she had placed between them. he did not seek her out. He did not force his presence on her. He communicated with her only through official channels, his missives polite, formal, and strictly related to her duties. But he watched. From a distance, he learned the rhythms of her diminished life. He knew she now took her morning tea in the east-facing solarium, the only place in the castle that caught the full force of the dawn. He knew she spent her evenings in the archives, losing herself in historical texts. He knew she had stopped visiting the gardens. His first act was small, almost invisible. One morning, he had the gardeners place a single, perfect pot of sun-basking jasmine on the small table in the solarium where she took her tea. It was her favorite flower, a detail she had mentioned in passing over a year ago. He did not leave a note. He did not wait for her reaction. He simply had it placed there, an anonymous offering of beauty. He learned from a servant that she had paused when she saw it, her hand hovering over the delicate white blossoms for a long moment before she sat down. She had not smiled, but she had not had it removed. It was the faintest glimmer of a possibility, and he clung to it like a drowning man. The second month continued in this vein. He began to anticipate her needs, not as a king demanding service, but as a silent observer. When he knew she would be working late in the archives, he would have a tray of hot food and tea left on a table just outside the doors, ensuring it was delivered by a junior servant she barely knew, so his own hand in it would be obscured. When a rare shipment of books arrived from the continent, he personally sorted through the crate and had the volumes on ancient cartography, her particular passion, quietly added to the shelves she frequented most. He was relearning how to love her. Not as a possession to be won, but as a person to be cared for. He was demonstrating his attention not through public spectacle, but through 1,000 tiny, unseen acts of consideration. He was trying to show her, in the only way he knew how, that he saw her. The real her. Not the prize, not the advisor, but the woman who loved the scent of jasmine and the feel of old maps. Arya's suspicion was a fortress. She saw the jasmine, and her first thought was that it was a test. She found the food outside the archives and assumed it was a standard courtesy for late working staff. But the pattern was too specific, too tailored to her own quiet preferences. A deep, weary caution settled in her. She did not allow herself to feel hope. Hope was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor she had so painstakingly constructed. She had been broken by his attention before. She would not be broken by this new, gentler version of it. She remained distant, polite, and observant. The turning point for her came near the end of the second month. She was in the council chambers, presenting a difficult report on a border dispute. One of the older, more belligerent lords, a man who had always resented her influence, began to tear into her analysis with undisguised contempt, his arguments laced with personal, misogynistic insults. In the past, Lucian, in his cold formality, might have let the debate play out, trusting her to defend herself. But this time was different. Before Arya could even formulate a response, Lucian's voice cut through the room, quiet but imbued with an absolute, chilling authority. "Lord Valerius?" The lord fell silent, startled. "Advisor Arya's analysis is, as always, impeccable," Lucian stated, his gaze like chips of ice. "Your disagreement is noted. Your disrespect is not. You will apologize to the advisor, or you will find your counsel is no longer required at this court. Not now, not ever." The chamber was utterly still. The lord, pale and shaking, stammered a clumsy apology. Arya was stunned into silence. Lucian hadn't defended her honor as a possession. He had defended her work, her intellect, her position. He had done it publicly, not for her, but for the entire court to see. He was re-establishing her authority, an authority his own actions had helped to undermine. He met her eyes across the room for a brief second, his expression unreadable, before turning the meeting to the next point of order. It was an act of public restitution, and it pierced her defenses in a way no pot of flowers ever could. That night, she touched the petals of the jasmine in the solarium, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than emptiness. It was a fragile, terrifying sprout of something she could not yet name. The third month marked a subtle but profound shift. The fortress of Arya's suspicion had not fallen, but a single gate had been cautiously unbarred. She began to test the new reality, to see if it was genuine. She started leaving books on obscure topics on the edge of her desk, and a day or two later, a related text would appear on a nearby shelf. She made a quiet complaint to the head of household about a draft in her room, and by evening, a master artisan was there, not just repairing the window frame, but replacing the entire casement with a new, more insulated design. His care was constant, quiet, and responsive. He was not leading, he was listening. Their interactions began to thaw, inch by painful inch. One afternoon, he sought her out in the library, holding a scroll. "Advisor," he said, his tone still formal but lacking the icy edge it once had. "I am struggling with the syntax on this elven trade treaty. Your grasp of the high dialect is superior to my own." It was a pretense, and they both knew it. His knowledge of the high dialect was flawless. It was an excuse to be near her, but it was an excuse predicated on respect for her skill. It was an offering of peace. She hesitated for a heart-stopping moment, then gestured to the seat opposite her. "Of course, Your Majesty." They worked for an hour in near silence, the only sounds the scratching of her quill and the rustle of vellum. But it was a shared silence, not an empty one. It was reminiscent of the easy companionship they had once known, and the memory was no longer just a source of pain. It was a ghost in the room, sad but not malevolent. When they were finished, he thanked her and left without trying to prolong the encounter. He was allowing her to set the pace, to define the boundaries. This deference, from a man of such absolute power, was a more potent apology than any words could ever be. The real breakthrough came during a week of relentless, soul-dampening rain. The castle was dreary, the stones seemed to weep, and a deep melancholy settled over everyone. Arya felt it keenly, the gray, sunless sky mirroring her own internal landscape. One evening she was in her chambers, staring into the fire, when a soft knock came at her door. It was a young servant girl, holding a heavy, velvet-wrapped object. "From the king, milady," she whispered, curtsying before scurrying away. Arya's hands trembled as she unwrapped it. It was a lumen sphere, a rare and costly artifact of magecraft. It was a globe of enchanted crystal that, when activated, would fill a room with a light that perfectly mimicked warm, natural sunlight. It even radiated a gentle, sun-like heat. He had found a way to bring the sun to her, here in the heart of his shadowed castle. Tucked into the velvet was a simple, unsigned note. On it, in his elegant, archaic script, was a single sentence. "So you do not have to miss it so much." She sank into her chair, sphere cradled in her lap, and she finally wept. But these were not the tears of heartbreak or despair. They were tears of a slow, painful, and overwhelming catharsis. He had remembered. He had listened. He had understood her deepest held value, her love for the sun, the very symbol of the humanity she had refused to sacrifice. And he had honored it. He had not tried to change her or possess her. He had simply sought to ease her sadness. It was the most profound act of love she had ever known. The fourth month was a time of tentative rebuilding. She activated the lumen sphere every evening, and the warm golden light filled her room, a silent testament to his change. She began seeking him out, using work as a pretext, and their conversations slowly expanded beyond matters of state. They spoke of history, of poetry, of the stars. They were rediscovering the friendship that had been the bedrock of their connection. But this time, There was a new, fragile awareness between them. An unacknowledged truth that was both a wound and a promise. He found her in the garden one afternoon, the first sunny day after the long rains. She was standing by a rosebush, her face tilted up to the sky, her eyes closed. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. She opened her eyes as he drew near, but she did not move away. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet watchfulness. "I feared you had forsaken this place," he said softly. "It didn't feel right for a time," she admitted, her voice equally quiet. "The flowers seemed too bright." They stood in silence for a long moment, the warmth of the real sun on their skin. "Arya," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "The last 4 months, it is not enough to atone for what I did. 1,000 years would not be enough. But I hope it has been enough to show you that I have learned. I see you. I finally, truly see you." She looked at him, at the genuine remorse and unwavering devotion in his twilight eyes. The last of the ice around her heart melted away. "I see you too, Lucian," she whispered. The king was gone, the monster was gone. There was only the man who had brought her the sun because she was sad. She took a small, hesitant step toward him, and it was all the invitation he needed. He closed the remaining distance between them, and, with infinite tenderness, he framed her face with his hands, his touch as gentle as a sigh. This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, she did not pull away. She rose to meet him, and the kiss was not one of hungry passion, but of quiet homecoming, of forgiveness, of a love that had been destroyed and painstakingly, miraculously, rebuilt. The years that followed were a testament to the promise made in that sunlit garden. Their union was not a matter of public declaration or grand ceremony. It was a quiet, profound weaving together of 2 lives. Lucian, having learned the devastating cost of his pride, ruled with a new and deeper wisdom. But his most important role became that of Arya's partner. He honored her humanity with a reverence that humbled his own court. He altered the ancient rhythms of the castle, creating sun-drenched courtyards and glass-walled libraries where she could work and read and live without feeling like a creature of the shadows. He became her gateway to the world, and she his anchor to humanity. Together they traveled. They stood before the thundering waterfalls of the southern jungles, the spray cool on her mortal skin. They walked the bustling, spice-scented markets of coastal city-states, his immortal senses overwhelmed by the sheer, chaotic vitality she reveled in. He would watch, cloaked and hooded against the daylight hours she cherished, as she learned to sail a ship, her laughter carrying on the sea breeze. He saw the world anew through her eyes, the fleeting beauty of a cherry blossom, the poignant melody of a street musician's song, the simple joy of a shared meal with strangers. He learned that love was not possession, but witness. It was the sacred act of watching the person you cherished become fully themselves. Arya, in turn, bloomed, secure in his love, a love that asked for nothing but her happiness. The fears of her own inadequacy faded into memory. She was not a footnote, she was his queen in all but name. Her counsel shaping the future of his kingdom, her intelligence and compassion earning her a fierce loyalty from his subjects, both mortal and immortal. She was his equal, and everyone knew it. The power she wielded was not borrowed from his crown, but radiated from her own being. She lived her life with a joyful, deliberate intensity. The first silver threads in her dark hair, which appeared a few years into their union, were met not with sorrow, but with a quiet sense of pride. The fine lines that began to appear around her eyes were a map of years filled with laughter and thought and wonder. Lucian traced them with a gentle finger, seeing not decay, but the beautiful, living record of the life they had built together. He loved every season of her, and his love was not diminished by time. It was deepened, enriched by the shared history etched into her very skin. They created their own traditions. On the anniversary of her refusal, they would sit in his study, the room no longer a place of pain but of profound beginnings, and they would read poetry aloud to one another. On the anniversary of their first kiss in the garden, they would spend the day in silence, simply being in each other's presence, a quiet acknowledgement of the hard-won peace they had found. He never once asked her to reconsider her choice. He never hinted at the eternity that separated them. He had promised her this life, her full, human, sunlit life, and he would have sooner torn his own heart out than break that vow. 10 years passed. 10 years of partnership, of shared purpose, of a love that grew deeper and more certain with each passing season. Arya was in her mid-30s now, the first whispers of maturity beginning to touch her features. She was no longer the young woman who had trembled in his study, terrified of her own inadequacy. She was a woman who had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. She knew her own worth. She knew the depth and constancy of his devotion. The old fears, the terror of being temporary, of being replaced, had been laid to rest by a decade of unwavering proof. They were in their favorite place, a small, glass-walled observatory he had built for her on the highest tower of the castle, a place that touched the sky. Below them, the kingdom sprawled, peaceful and prosperous. It was sunset, and the sky was painted in fiery strokes of orange, pink, and violet. It was the kind of fleeting, breathtaking beauty she had always treasured most. She stood at the glass, watching the sun dip toward the horizon, and he stood beside her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. For a long time, they watched in comfortable silence. The first stars began to prick the deepening indigo of the sky. Arya turned her head and looked at him. The love in her eyes was as clear and deep as it had been for years. All the old fears, all the insecurities, were ghosts of a distant past, long since laid to rest. She was not a temporary diversion. She was the core of his world. He had proven it every single day for 10 years. "Lucian," she said softly, her voice steady and clear. He turned to her, his twilight eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Yes, my love?" She took a slow breath, and when she spoke, her words carried a quiet strength, an absolute certainty born not of impulse, but of a decade of trust and partnership. "I refused you once," she said, "because I was afraid. Afraid of being less, afraid of losing myself. But I was wrong about something fundamental." His breath caught, his eyes widening slightly as he sensed the weight of what was coming. "I thought I had to choose between my humanity and loving you," she continued, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "But these 10 years have shown me the truth. I don't lose myself by being with you. I become more myself. You have honored every part of who I am, my love for the sun, my need for freedom, my work, my passions. You have never asked me to be anything other than exactly who I am." Tears began to well in his eyes, centuries-old defenses crumbling. "I have lived, Lucian," she said, her voice unwavering. "I have felt the sun on my skin and the rain on my face. I have laughed and worked and traveled and grown. I have been wholly, completely myself. And through all of it, you have been my partner, my equal, the person who sees me most clearly." She took both his hands in hers, holding his gaze with an intensity that made his immortal heart ache. "I am not the frightened girl who said no in your study. I am a woman who knows her own mind and her own heart. And my heart tells me that I don't want this to end. Not in 40 years. Not ever." His hands tightened on hers, his voice barely a whisper. "Arya, I am not giving up my humanity," she said firmly, answering the question he had never dared to ask. "I am choosing to extend it. I am choosing forever, with you. Not as a sacrifice, not out of fear of death or age, but because I have lived fully as a mortal, and found that the life I want, the only life I want, is one where I continue to walk beside you. I am ready. I am asking you to make me yours for all of time." It was not the plea of someone escaping mortality. It was the choice of a woman who had found her completion in partnership. who had discovered that love, real love, was not about possession or fear, but about two souls choosing, again and again, to build a life together. And now she was choosing an eternity of those choices. Tears, the first he had shed in centuries, traced silver paths down Lucian's face. This was not the victory of a king claiming his prize. It was the solemn, sacred acceptance of a gift freely and consciously given. It was the ultimate expression of her trust, the final, beautiful healing of the wound he had inflicted so long ago. He pulled her close, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in all of creation. Because she was. "Arya," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with an eternity of love. "It is all I have ever wanted, all I have ever hoped for. But I will ask you once more, as I should have asked you 10 years ago. Are you certain? Truly certain?" She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, and her smile was radiant, free of doubt or shadow. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." As the last light of dusk faded from the sky and the stars shone down upon them, he knew that their story was not ending. It was simply turning to a new, infinite page. And this time, she was turning it with him, not out of fear or pressure, but out of the quiet, unshakable certainty that came from a decade of being loved exactly as she was.